Well, I think it's a bit of a kick in the guts for Australian viewers. We've been saying for a long time that this was going to happen because we've had out-of-date legislation that was created in the 1990s. It was very clear that subscription streaming services overseas were acquiring sports rights, and that's exactly what we're seeing happening here.
Would the proposed updated anti-siphoning legislation now before the Parliament have prevented Amazon from locking these matches behind a paywall?
In this case, no, and that's because in the case of World Cup cricket, the only games that are on the list are ones that are played in Australia and New Zealand. So you'd need to add all Australian games, no matter where they'd played, and then that would be covered under the new legislation.
So you don't think that home ground matches should be the yardstick for sports in the national interest here for Australian audiences?
Well, I think it's very clear there's a very high appetite for sports that are played overseas, and we saw that just last week with the World Cup cricket match where millions of viewers turned in. So it's not really related to where the game's played, it's who's playing.
Prime Video says its audience is consistently asking for live sports. Could other Australian favourites such as AFL, rugby league and tennis be in Amazon sites next?
I'm sure they are, and there's a real jeopardy that that could actually happen unless we get this legislation through the Parliament very quickly.
Was anything about Amazon's play a surprise?
No, unfortunately it's not. We've been speaking to various governments about this likelihood for at least 5 and probably more years. And we now do have legislation in the Parliament, but it could be even another 6 months before it's passed.
Sports fans who are keen and have the means to do so can now watch nearly all, if not all, sport without ads on other providers. What do you believe the future of sports broadcasting is on free TV?
Well, it's got a strong future on free TV, and we've already seen with pay TV that we can have great coverage of the iconic sporting events on free-to-air plus complementary coverage on pay TV. So if you look at something like the AFL, you'll get the best games on free-to-air through the whole competition plus the finals and grand final. If you're a sports nut and you want to watch every single game, then you're probably going to subscribe to Foxtel for that.
But live sport is one of the few remaining linear TV draw cards for both audiences and advertisers. Is losing the rights to key sports the beginning of the end for broadcast television?
Well, we see a strong future for broadcast television, but sport is very much part of that future, and it's also a part of the future for the Australian public because the policy around anti-siphoning is not really about favouring one commercial interest over another. It's really about making sure that every single Australian has the right to watch sporting events for free. And that's because they're part of the national fabric. They're something that bring us together as a nation. Probably during the Matildas campaign this year, almost every Australian was going into work and talking about what had happened last night or how excited they were for the match ahead. And that's something that creates a community, and that's why we have rules around this sort of thing and why we've got to keep them.
So if sport is the key to the future of broadcast television, are you certain that the federal government is going to get this legislation through and do what's needed to protect it?
Well, the government has expressed a strong commitment to the future of the list, and they did so before the last election, and the legislation that went into Parliament last week is evidence of that. And I think that's pretty much across the board. There's nothing more that resonates with Australian people than their love for free sport. But the legislation that went into the Parliament last week does have one key oversight, and that's relating to whether people can watch free sport in the digital environment. So we know that about 15 to 20% of Australians are currently accessing their free television services using a streaming app. That might be iView, or it might be 7plus or 9Now or 10Play. And those people may not have access to free sport under the new legislation, and that's because the legislation has left out the offering of digital rights as opposed to over-the-air terrestrial rights.
Does losing the rights and the ability to broadcast major sports pose a death knell for Foxtel?
Well, I think Foxtel's got plenty of sports rights now, and everyone's in a competitive marketplace, but you know, it is a key pillar for most broadcasters. So we want to make sure that we've set up the market to ensure that we get the best amount of coverage, both free and paid, for the Australian public.
Bridget Fair, thank you.
Thanks.